So welcome everybody to this week's PalaeoPERCS. It's so nice to see such a big audience here this week. So my name is Rayma and I will be hosting the seminar today. And we're really excited to welcome our speaker, Sibusiso Biyela from ScienceLink in South Africa. And his talk is entitled Dinosaurs and Decolonizing Science Writing. So the format of today's seminar, so we have welcome and announcements for 5 minutes, followed by Sibusiso's talk, followed by a Q&A, and then tea time with our speaker. So don't forget to send questions via the chat to the questions at PalaeoPERCS host, and this week Kate is your questions host. So a bit of housekeeping. So we value the participation of everyone interested in the paleosciences. So please remember to abide by our code of conduct during today's seminar, and remember to mute yourself for the duration of the talk. If you somehow found yourself here without having signed our code of conduct, please take a minute to go to our website and have a look at this. And a reminder again, you can ask questions by chatting to the questions at PalaeoPERCS host, and any technical issues should also go there as well. We now have closed captions built into Zoom, so remember to use the CC button to show or hide them. We also have our weekly SurveyMonkey for demographic info. So this is optional, but very much encouraged and all anonymous, and you'll be able to find that in the chat window very shortly. So now to introduce our speaker. So this week we have Sibusiso Biyela. So he did his bachelor's in chemistry and physics from the University of Zululand. And so far in his career, he's been a journalist, a television producer, a scriptwriter, and is currently a science communicator at ScienceLink in South Africa, and is also a science writer as well. And you can find him on Twitter at AstroSibs, and his website is detailed there as well. So now I'm going to hand over the screen share. So good luck, Sibusiso. I hope you have a great talk.
Thank you very much. Right. Thank you very much for that. My name is Sibusiso Biyela, as I've been introduced. I understand everyone here, almost everyone here, basically postdocs and other advanced qualifications. Hopefully, I can give you some insights in some of the work that I have done myself as a science communicator. So the title of my talk today is Dinosaurs and Decolonizing Science Writing. Okay. So my journey began a couple of years ago with this specific story. I wanted to write a science article about a new dinosaur that was described in South Africa, a new species called Le Dumahadi Mafube. This new species is a sort of sauropodomorph, sort of an ancestor to, or related ancestor to sauropods that came later. And I thought it would be interesting to write the story, but instead of doing it in a typical way for the science news website that I work for, SciBri, or that I write for, SciBri, I had the issue that there's no scientific or there's no Zulu word for the word dinosaur, and a bunch of other issues, but some more details on the dinosaur itself. So the name Letumahadi Mafube means thunderclap at dawn. It's one of the few, or one of the only dinosaur species named after using in African indigenous language. In this case, the language that's been used is Sutu. I do not speak Sutu myself. I speak Zulu, which is one of the official 11 official languages found in South Africa, none of those languages are indigenous African languages, and the other two are European languages, one which is Afrikaans, a derivative of Dutch, and the other one is English. Okay, so some more details about the dinosaur itself. It's basically thought to weigh around 12 metric tons. It dates back, the fossil dates back to around 200 million years. Yeah, and it's basically my job for the story was to write a science story about the dinosaur, which is something that should have been easy, but I encountered some obstacles. Chief among these obstacles is that there's no word for Zulu. I mean, there's no word for dinosaur in Zulu, which isn't the only issue there. Uh, when it came to writing the story, which is something I do professionally all the time, I encountered the problem of a lack of scientific terms for simple words like dinosaur and other words like Jurassic or fossilization or even evolution. And this is a problem because in South Africa, Zulu is spoken by some 10 million people. So my language, the Zulu language, simply doesn't have the words for communicating science, which is something I found to be problematic because at that time I just wanted to write a scientific story in my own language. And the challenges that I expected to find was how to explain these complex scientific terms and not encounter the issue of not having the scientific terms in the first place to describe for the story. So the story started not just being about the dinosaur itself, but about how I came up with the scientific terms or the scientific translations to these scientific terms. So my story became an attempt to tell a science story in a language that science had previously overlooked. In a way, it was a small contribution amongst an increasing number that aim to help decolonize South African science writing. I would love to discuss decolonization in more detail during tea time as well. So my attempts to write this was met with an incredible number of pitfalls. So the story became exponentially more difficult to write about in my native language. Okay, so in South Africa, language is inextricably linked with the racial history of apartheid in South Africa. If you're unfamiliar with the history of South Africa in that sense, there was a set of laws, a regime that sought to separate the races in South Africa by privileging whites and then reducing societally disadvantaging blacks in South Africa, and the apartheid regime did a lot of took on a lot of strategies in order to make that disadvantage possible. And the one that I'm interested in today is how science was taught in schools at the time. So one of these systems was called Bantu education, which was a separate educational system set aside for Black people, which essentially said that Black people need not understand science and mathematics because they won't become doctors or engineers or anything like that. They shouldn't be allowed to become any of those things. Not because they're not smart enough, but the black man isn't supposed to be any of those things. So upon the introduction of Bantu education also came with it an instruction from the government that instruction in schools should be done in Afrikaans, which was a problem for a lot of black students. Yes, they did understand Afrikaans, but they wanted to be taught in English. And when it comes to even being taught in their own native languages, that wasn't discussed, but they saw Afrikaans as a language of oppression, and this led to the 1976 Soweto uprisings, which started as peaceful protests that were interrupted by violence from the police and the deaths of many young students. And that event has reverberated to throughout the history of South Africa since then, and it's commemorated every June 16. So, an interesting part of Afrikaans as well is that in the 1970s, it was transformed essentially into a language of science. The government put a lot of resources and money into turning Afrikaans into a language of science and engineering, producing lexicons and other scientific items of and other items of scientific importance. I think they realized at the time the future of science in the world, even in the 70s, and wanted Afrikaans to be part of that future. So even today, you can write science exams either in English or Afrikaans and no other language in the country. So none of the other indigenous African languages in South Africa got the same treatment or the same respect to be turned into languages of science. So even today, when you discuss anything scientific or technological, you can only do it in English or Afrikaans, and you can't do it in my native language of isiZulu or any other indigenous African languages in South Africa. So in a way, when it comes to discussing any other issue like politics and sports in the country, it's very easy to discuss those things in your own language. But when it comes to science and technology, you have to code switch to English, and in a way, science itself becomes an unwelcome visitor in those discussions. And I've long had trouble with that issue, trying to explain science to my friends and family and having to switch to English in order to make sense of it. Okay. Oh, yes. This also only having Afrikaans and English as a language of science also presents a lot of issues when it comes to scientific matters such as health. As you know, South Africa was devastated by the HIV pandemic, and it's taken a lot of work to try to explain or try to communicate issues like CD4 counts, viral loads, and other things around HIV that are deeply scientific and very difficult to explain in English in the first place, and even more difficult to explain when it comes to science, but in my case, I'll be speaking specifically to dinosaurs. So, when it came to writing the story, working on this science story, the easy thing would have been to write the story in English and then translate it to isiZulu. But the issue is, yes, it is the easy thing to do. But the trouble is, anyone who would have read that dinosaur story in isiZulu, having been translated from English, would have detected that the story is a translated one. Although the words might have all been correct and the facts correct in it, it's very easy to detect when something's been directly translated as opposed to being written straight from an isiZulu perspective, from a Zulu perspective. An example that you can think of when it comes to this is it's very easy to look at an instruction manual, maybe for a new TV, and see and notice that it's been translated from a Chinese or a Japanese, or that it's been translated from Japanese or Chinese. It's very easy to detect that the tone sounds very weird and different, even if everything is grammatically correct. So I was trying to avoid that, and also as a form of respect that I'm writing this story for Zulu writers. Yeah, I've explained that. So, having looked at the original paper, I highlighted a few of the scientific words and terms and tried to think of Zulu counterparts to try to explain exactly how what the so I looked at the scientific paper itself and looked at some of the terms that I think would be problematic to try to explain in Zulu because the Zulu terms don't exist themselves. So in that sense, I had the task of coming up, inventing words and explanations for scientific terms that are easy to explain in English. Some of them are, but are very difficult to explain in isiZulu, and one of those is, of course, dinosaur. So you can imagine, how do you explain a dinosaur to someone who doesn't know the term in the first place? And to be clear, it's not that Zulu speakers do not understand English. I think it just sounds and feels better to read something in your own language. You tend to own it better. You tend to remember it more. You tend to appreciate it more than reading it exclusively in English. So I found that, oh yeah, and one of those words that I found is the term, let me read this correctly, parasagittal limbs, which I don't think a lot of English speakers know exactly. So in a sense, I found that for what, like for words, for scientific terms like the one mentioned here, that the act of translating science into Zulu can also benefit English speakers, such as in talking about understanding exactly what a dinosaur is, which is something a lot of even English speakers don't know exactly. A lot of English speakers think they know what a dinosaur is. A lot of us who know what a dinosaur is take it for granted to explain to readers or other people exactly what a dinosaur is. And for a lot of people who don't know what a dinosaur is, think it's a bit late now to they're too afraid to ask exactly what it is because you see a lot of things on television and movies and magazines that you think is a dinosaur, but isn't. Those include pterodactyls, mosasaurs, and other related reptiles that aren't dinosaurs at all. Okay, so one of an example of that is like a Dimetrodon is not a dinosaur as we know, but if you look at an image of it, it looks like a dinosaur, but it isn't. So it's problematic if I'm speaking in English with some readers about what a dinosaur is, and then tell them that it's not a mosasaur. So I took advantage of that problem when it came to writing for Zulu readers. The idea that a lot of people misunderstand what a dinosaur is, I thought it would be great to try to explain it better to readers without having them have that mistake transferred to them. The word dinosaur sounds awesome, but of course, as we know, it's a bit of a misnomer. Yes, dinosaurs are. Some of them do look like lizards, but most of them aren't terrible lizards. I think some of them look cute with their feathers and stuff, but most of them, as you know, aren't terrible lizards. So, which is the Greek term dinosaur as it was invented. But it's too late now to change the term for English speakers, but it's not yet too late for Zulu speakers and other speakers of indigenous languages that don't have a word for dinosaur. So I took this as an opportunity to correct that as much as I could. Um, Okay. So, as I said before, translation for me presented an opportunity to explain things better, including dinosaur, and just to make the science communication in English better as well. So, sometimes you can try to explain something in isiZulu and find that if you translate that directly into English from isiZulu, it's a better explanation for a complex scientific term than the what you would try before you translate it back. Um, but with the limited time and space, I had to come up with. I mean, I could spend a whole article explaining what a dinosaur is, but I decided to just give it a name, and I'll explain what the name that I came up with is. Luckily, Zulu is a very descriptive language in the words that it has. Like one or two words can be the equivalent of a whole sentence in English. So if you told someone about a dinosaur and they have no idea what it is, it'll take a while to explain what it is. But in isiZulu, the words that I came up with or the words that I chose ended up just explaining very quickly what a dinosaur is. And then moved on, and then you move on to other explanations to talk about the actual Letumahadi Mafube in the story. Okay, so that's a Dimetrodon, it's not a dinosaur. So some of the words that I translated in the article, and I'll read out the Zulu terms and explain what they mean. Dinosaur, like I said, I went for accuracy over too much explanation. So for dinosaur, isilwane sasemandulo, which means ancient animal. I find this to be accurate for someone who's hearing about a dinosaur for the first time or doesn't understand what it is. And then what I do in these stories, I then explain further what the dinosaur is in this instance. And I explained what the Tumahadi Mafube is after explaining that it's an ancient animal. And how far along ago it lived, and some of its attributes as well. For parasagittal limbs, that's imilenze eqondile. In isiZulu, to try directly translate to straight limbs or straight legs. And then there's evolution. I liked this one. Evolution is basically usombuluka kwendalo, which roughly translates to the origin of species or origin of nature, animals, and plants itself. So it's all encompassing. Fossil. I had a little trouble with fossil because a lot of people know fossils to be ancient bones found in the ground that have turned to mineral or and stuff like that. But there's also shells and other soft tissue. There's leaves, there's bark, there's all sorts of stuff that isn't just bone. So, but for this, in this case, I just went for ancient bones found in the ground, which is amatambo, amadala, tolagala, emhlabathini. And then there's quadruped, which is ukuba mlenzemine, and in Zulu it directly translates to be legs of four or to have four legs. And then there's osteohistology as a final example that I used there, which is ukucwaninga amathambo or the study of bones simply. So I found a lot of these opportunities to take these complex scientific terms and explain them by giving them names that directly explain it, because luckily Zulu is able to do that, and that's why I'm saying there's a great opportunity to try to translate scientific stories or scientific terms in your indigenous language, and that usually, if you translate that back into English, it's a great explanation for the lay reader. Okay, so yes, like I explained, how I tried to talk about Letumahadi Mafube as being a an ancient animal. Sure, I would have preferred some more specific language, but for the purposes of my story, ancient animal works out perfectly. I spent more effort in explaining what the dinosaur that I'm talking about is exactly and what it's like. And isiZulu, and in isiZulu, I explained that Letumahadi Mefube is basically a creature of elephant-like size and shape, with a head and neck resembling a stiff, tiny headed snake and a tail resembling that of a monitor lizard, to roughly explain. So, in isiZulu, you can imagine how amazing this sounds. And I found that talking about dinosaurs in isiZulu brings back the magic of how dinosaurs were spoken about back when they were found 300 or 400 years ago and described. So for a Zulu speaker is able to experience that magic of discovering what a dinosaur is by hearing how it's explained. So in this case, I chose to write my first Zulu story in a Zulu science story about dinosaurs, specifically because of how awesome it sounds in this Zulu. And specifically because South Africa is rich with a lot of paleontological finds and research as well, but also because paleontology is a storytelling science. I think it's one that lends itself to imaginative tales of origin and how things came to be. So, such stories are a staple of Zulu culture, and to Zulu speakers, encourage encountering dinosaurs through the lens of their native tongue for the first time makes them seem like mythical creatures straight out of fireside folk tales. So that's the advantage that I found in it, and that's the advantage that I took. But the great question is why do all this? I can get it from this specific quote from a sociologist here in South Africa, which is: without literacy in the languages of the masses, science and technology cannot be culturally owned by Africans. Africans will remain mere consumers, incapable of creating competitive goods, services, and the value additions in this era of globalization. So it was with this quote in mind, or and this dream of reclaiming cultural ownership of the thought language of science, which has been taken away from Africans for such a long time, that I set out to tell an authentically Zulu story about the giant thunderclap at dawn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such a great talk. It's really interesting to hear this. So my parents are from Tanzania and they speak Swahili, so it's cool to learn about Zulu too. Um, so just a reminder that if anyone has any questions, to send these to the questions at PalaeoPERCS host, and then we can read them out. So we have one question through already. So what do you think about authors using Indigenous languages to name taxa when none of the authors speak those languages or are from those places?
Okay, that's something I've been thinking about quite a lot, and it's related to something I'd like to call Africa washing, which is like whitewashing, but using African terms, African indigenous terms for the names of companies and other things like that to seem authentically African without actually having anyone African on the team. I think it's a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's enough at all. And I'm quite cynical about scientific teams who choose to do that, but not have anyone who speaks that language on the team. And unfortunately, paleontology in South Africa has the history of excluding Black or Indigenous contributors to the research, people who were present at the excavation site, people without which that discovery would not have been made, people who know the landscape, and people of skills that have been important to the discovery itself and the description of a certain fossil discovery. So yes, it's something that I'm aware of, and it's something that I'm quite unhappy about. And I think it's something I might have to investigate further to try to see if there's any efforts in South Africa to address it, because it is something that I find particularly I'm particularly dissatisfied with that attempt at decolonization without having any contributions from the people whose language is used in it.
So we have another one through. Do you think any of these amazing descriptive terms you've coined will or should become standard in the Zulu language?
Thank you for that question. No. In the article that I wrote explaining my process here, I go into more detail in the sense that it's language is so dynamic, and you never really know what's going to become a meme or something that's going to be adopted by the culture and used throughout the language. So that's not my intention. I mean, I'd love for that to be the case, but what I would like for other people to adopt is not the terms themselves, but the method with which I come up with those terms. The descriptions are more important than the terms themselves, and I like it when some scientists have consulted with me to ask whenever they discover new species and things like that, and they want to give it new names, or if they want to write to communicate their science with Zulu speakers and other indigenous speakers. I like what they've been doing, trying to adopt the method of translation rather than the actual terms, like for dinosaur or anything like that. So the specific terms aren't that much of an issue for me. I wouldn't want them to be. I mean, I'd love for some of them to be used. That'd be great. But it's the descriptions that I think are more important, the thought process that goes behind trying to come up with a term or trying to describe it in Zulu.
Cool. So we have a question through from Nuseba. There are cases where the authors work together with local Indigenous communities to choose a name, I think in New Zealand or Australia. Do you think this is a better option?
It's a great option if I mean it's a great option if there was no like I said before, if there's no contribution from contribution to the science itself from the locals who helped them make that discovery a while back. I think it's not enough. I think it's very seldom that in a lot of places, such as in South Africa, a lot of people come from the UK to come to make discoveries here or to provide descriptions. It's very rare that they would find those fossils or those discoveries by themselves without any local knowledge, local indigenous knowledge that would help them find it. So I think if in the case where they did it by themselves and there was no one to help, then I think yes, it's. I think it would be enough, but I think that's rarely the case.
So we have another one through. So if I'd like to know your thoughts about this. If there are any Zulu myths or stories that might represent the culture's own engagement with and understanding of fossils, could that be another avenue to communicating science with that community?
Yes, definitely. I like that idea. Growing up, there's a lot of folk tales that I was told, and a lot of those have a lot of descriptions of um, something that you might attribute to dinosaurs, these giant lizard-like creatures. That if you were to adopt some of those stories or the way those stories are told, but then talk about them in scientific terms, I think it would be a great idea to use that, especially in talking about looking at the mythology of such as the creation stories in Zulu. That talk about how things came about. If we can use that kind of storytelling to talk about these ancient creatures like dinosaurs and particularly hominids that are discovered here in South Africa all of the time and described here in South Africa being the cradle of mankind. I mean, it's disappointing that we are the cradle of mankind, but there's not much scientific communication in native languages here in South Africa. So, if we can find a way to use those folk tales to to describe these creatures, I think I'd go for that, and I think it would be a great idea. There's a lot of opportunity to do that.
So we have a question through from Flavia. Thank you for the very interesting talk. Just wondering whether you'd like to repeat this for other South African Indigenous languages.
Thanks, Flavia. I hope I'm talking to the right Flavia. I quite enjoyed your talk from the other day. I think, yes, definitely it can be repeated for other indigenous languages in South Africa. Luckily, of the 9 indigenous South African languages, they fit into 3 or 4 distinct groupings. Um, Such as mine, Zulu is included in a group of 5 languages that are quite similar. So my work in just one language covers 5 languages already. And then there's another group as well that includes Sutu, Tswana, and Pedi. So that would be a great way to yes, I think it can be very repeatable, and I've spoken to other science communicators and scientists who are trying to do that for their own languages. There isn't anything formal being done exactly at the moment. There's a lot of work being done by universities in South Africa, but there's a lot of momentum in trying to repeat what I've done, or that's something that is being done even before I started for all the other indigenous languages in South Africa. There is unfortunately 2 or 3 languages that are spoken by less than 1 million people in South Africa, which is a country of close to just over 50 million. So I would like not just Zulu, which is one of the most dominant languages in the country, but for other languages as well to be included in what I've done here.
We have another question through. Did you get any feedback on your article from Zulu speakers? Do you know if it had an impact in terms of teaching people about dinosaurs?
Yes, I've had some feedback from people who are close to me personally while they were reading it. They couldn't believe what they were reading when they were reading it in Zulu, and I've heard from other science communicators and other Zulu speakers as well who've quite enjoyed my efforts in that, and they learned things about dinosaurs that they either wouldn't have cared about or would not have understood otherwise because it wasn't presented to them in that sense. So for me, it is quite a high impact in that it's reached people that it would not have otherwise. And there's other people who are communicating sciences and engineering, like stuff like space travel and a bunch of other things because of that. Not because of me, but it's quite inspiring to see that happening because it reaches a lot more people than an English one would. And again, not because Zulu speakers don't understand English. They're quite good at understanding English, but it just sounds better if you are talking about it in isiZulu, and I think it provides more resources to be able to talk to people who don't understand English. Because before, a lot of people didn't want to invest in talking about science in isiZulu because the resources don't exist. So I'm trying, and a bunch of other people as well, trying to make that a reality so that journalists and science communicators are able to communicate with those people. So, yeah.
So we have one more. I am an American paleontologist with field sites near Kuruman. So far, I've worked with a professor at the University of Johannesburg to access the sites where I work, but he has kind of an ivory tower approach to science communication. I'd like to connect with local communities near my field sites. Do you know of any organization that I could reach out to that might help me make those connections?
I can think of a few. There is there's Harry, which, if I remember correctly, is something to do with human origins. They're sort of a paleontological group. It might not be specifically about your own research, but uh, they are working very hard to talk to communities, local communities, and other to make their research more accessible and to make sure that their research is accessible to the people who are supposed to read it. But yes, we can talk specifically once I can think of the other organizations that can help you find those communities. The company that I work for specializes in something like that, but I can refer you to those other either not so much organizations, but researchers who are passionate science communicators themselves who can point you in the right direction. Specifically, people in a field that's more related to yours.
Cool. Okay, so we don't have any more questions through. Thank you again so much for such a great talk. It was really, really interesting to learn about this. So I'm going to take over the screen share and just do a quick outro. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. Please remember to fill out the survey message, so the link will be in the chat very shortly, so we can learn a bit more about who attended today's seminar. And join us next week to hear from Agatha Tumula and Mariage in France to hear all about the evolution of temperature seasonality from the mid-Eocene to the early Oligocene, a model data journey. So up next, if you're joining us for tea time, this will take place very, very shortly. So why should you join? So you can learn more about today's speaker, their path and the work that they do, meet new friends and bump into old ones, discuss the talk with paleo fans with different backgrounds, or just unwind with a chat before heading back to your regularly scheduled day. We will now have a quick break before tea time. So remember to get up, walk around, have a drink of water, and come back in 2 minutes. And if you have pets, they are very, very welcome to join us too. So I'm going to start the timer.